In the last few minutes here at the Kenyatta International Convention Center in Nairobi, we'll say history has been made as the Africa Climate Summit came to a close with the Nairobi Declaration that was adopted here and declared. And we're standing with the man who has been part of this journey leading up to this very point and appreciates what it's taken to get those signatures, the intricacies, because it did take quite a while, as well as now the way forward, his reaction to the summit that has been, and what he feels we should push for as Africa moving forward in terms of climate change and concerns. Mohamed Adow is the director of the think tank Climate and the Climate and Energy think tank that pushes for the rights and advocacy on and around issues of climate change. So first of all, your reaction and highlights to the 3 days that we've experienced here at the KICC. What has stood out for you?
I think this is the first ever Africa Climate Summit. It's taken us over 33 years since the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was agreed for the continent of Africa to come together in a summit outside the international summit. That itself is a major step. And so this was an opportunity to rally the whole continent behind an alternative vision for Africa in tackling climate change. And I must say, even though we have a Nairobi Declaration that is titled Climate Declaration, there isn't anything substantially new in that declaration.
You are the director of that think tank that I've just mentioned. It's called Power Shift. Any power shift that you've seen after this summit in terms of the climate talk globally?
I think it will be good to acknowledge that Africans coming together at a heads of state level, even though not many of them showed up, and acknowledging the importance of climate change and working together to set a vision for climate, I think it's good progress. Okay. What isn't good, I must tell you, is that the climate summit that we've had was in a large way actually interfered with by the historic polluters. We will have loved the rest of the world to come to Nairobi, witness what Africans are planning, but not veto African climate policy making. We've seen particularly the US pushing for climate carbon markets so that they can extract out of this continent what I will call pollution permits. They call them carbon credits, and they promise us crumbs in the name of those permits. But what they are effectively is Africa allowing the historic polluters, particularly the fossil fuel companies, to continue to pollute and then transfer their emission reduction obligations to the continent of Africa. And in that process, giving Africans crumbs. And we're so desperate for cash. It's like an African in the middle of Sahara Desert, lacking water, and you're offered your urine. You take it to save your life, but it won't actually secure you.
My goodness. I mean, there's a highlight there yesterday with John Kerry representing the US government on President Biden on matters climate here for this conference. And he made a promise, or at least support to the continent. Is that anything to welcome?
Absolutely no. 30 million from the wealthiest country in the world that is responsible for a third of the historic emissions coming to the most vulnerable continent that is also the least responsible and has massive potential to contribute to solve a problem that we didn't create in the first place is actually an insult. 30 million between 55 countries won't go far in helping to actually change the path this continent is taking. Neither will it help this continent to be able to adapt to the inevitable impact of climate change that we're suffering. 30 million from the wealthiest nation, from the country that is responsible for a third of the historic emissions, is actually an insult. And what our leaders should have done is decline, because it undermines the premise of historic responsibility. What the world has agreed through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is for us to tackle climate change by taking into account equity and historic, the difference in historic contributions to the climate problem, but also to account for our difference in capability. In terms of historic contribution, the US is the biggest historic polluter. In terms of capability, it has the greatest financial and technological wherewithal. And for us to be able to contribute to solve this problem that we didn't cause in the first place, so that we can help the world be able to attain the global targets that was agreed in 2015, we will need finance, we need clean technology, and none of those things were made available here.
There's something, and I want you to explain it in day-to-day people language, everyday people language, because what you've mentioned, climate, the carbon market, and the carbon credits, someone has called it wash, if you may, money laundering of climate change discussion. I don't know if you agree with that, but in a nutshell, what is a carbon market and what's a carbon credits?
So it's actually wash, and that's a good phrase to use it. But wash of the emission reductions obligations.
Okay.
It's in fact a wolf in sheep clothing. What they offer in Africa is some monies, okay? But we need to understand what Africa has been asked to do is basically to forego at least 5% of its land.
Okay.
5% of Africa's land, so that we can be able to contribute to a 2 gigaton reduction of emissions. What this means effectively is the historic polluter who's caused the climate problem will continue emitting on a business as usual way. No cuts, no decarbonization. What the planet requires today is rapid, massive reductions in emissions.
Yes.
We're on a pathway to 2.4 degrees above pre-industrial level. At the moment, our world has warmed at 1.1 degree above pre-industrial level. We can see the impacts that are hitting our planet, whether it's drought, whether it's floods, whether it's cyclone. We are suffering fast and worst the impact of climate change.
Yes.
We're bearing the greatest brunt for these impacts. So what you will expect is we'll have all hands on deck, and we will do what science says is required, which is to decarbonize at the source.
Yes.
So instead of, let's take the example of Delta Airlines. So instead of Delta Airlines cutting its emissions and shifting to cleaner energy, what they will do is buy pollution permits. And I want you to understand this.
Carbon credits.
It's not carbon credit. It's not carbon credit. That's a sexy term they've given so that they allow you to think they're giving you money and they take the credit for the carbon reductions that you will offer. You'll be able to deliver. What effectively this means is they're buying a permit from us so that they can continue to pollute. That way, instead of cutting emissions, and that is what the atmosphere needs, they will buy themselves out of the reductions.
Yes.
And that is what they've called carbon credits. And I want people to understand, from a climate perspective, there is no absolute reduction in emissions. There is a transfer of emissions from an industrialized country or company to an African community. And so from what the atmosphere sees, it's basically +1 -1. So Africa will conserve its forest so that we can protect the carbon sinks. And instead of actually rewarding us for protecting this planet's lungs, they will use those emissions reductions that will have been attained through Africa's protection of our forests to be able to pollute an equivalent amount of emissions at a time when science says clearly we must cut emissions.
So in your view, we're getting the raw end of the deal, and this is not something to support?
This is something we must reject.
Okay.
But Africa cannot afford to allow the West to get away with this cheating. This is actually undermining the integrity of the environmental regime.
Do you see the goodwill to reject this collectively as Africa?
So this is a sad reality. You can imagine with this continent that is home to 17% of the global population and account for less than 4% of the historic emissions, is desperate for cash because we are home to 600 million people without electricity, 970 million Africans without clean cooking. And we want to develop our energy. We're desperate for cash, we're desperate for clean technology. And so the analogy I will give you so that you can actually understand the situation our African leaders are in is if you found yourself in the middle of a desert and you've run out of water, okay? And you're hanging there for your life and somebody offers you your urine to drink. It's an ugly analogy, but that is the situation Africans are in. We're desperate for cash.
And we're drinking that urine.
We're drinking that urine.
So moving forward, we have the Nairobi Declaration. It's a conversation starter. It's not enough. What should we do as we go to New York, as we go to UAE in the conversation of climate? change?
Before we even go to New York or Dubai, we need to go back to our capitals, the 55 capitals in Africa.
Yes.
We need to actually have a conversation around what are the structural issues that holds this continent back. We have a food deficit. 85% of the food we eat in this continent is actually imported. Okay. At the point at which we attained our independence, we were the bread basket of the world.
Yeah.
We're now a basket case. The reason that is happening is because we've neglected our food sovereignty. Until we can transform our food and agricultural systems and be able to produce food in this continent, we will not be able to actually deliver what are the aspirations of our people. The second deficit we have is this energy deficit. You know, we have limited energy access. 600 million Africans don't have electricity. And so we need to actually take seriously the aspiration of this continent to be able to power itself and do it in a climate compatible way. The third thing that I want us to actually engage on is the fact that we don't have a Pan-African green industrialization. The 40% of the critical minerals that the world requires to be able to deliver the global energy transitions are in Africa. And this is something acknowledged in the declaration. But what it doesn't offer is the opportunity for Africa to develop a Pan-African industrial policy where we can add value to our exports. Rather than exporting our critical strategic minerals, how can we aggregate in Africa and be able to produce these minerals here so that we can export finished product, whether it's battery, whether it's solar panel. Because what is happening today is we export our raw materials and then we import the finished product. We sell cheaply and the products we import are expensive. And now what that effectively implies is we're importing inflation. We're using hard currency to import finished products that our economies are dependent on, and we're not investing in a green industrialization in Africa. So that conversation needs to happen in Africa. Yes. This is a starter and an important starter. I hope it raises Africans' consciousness on the climate threat and engages African leaders to actually identify the structural traps that are holding Africa back so that we can break free from these traps. Unless we address our food sovereignty, unless we address our energy and our renewable energy sovereignty, and be able to develop a green industrial plan, we will still remain dependent on external partners.
Finally, all this sounds very high level because you're saying go back to your capitals, think about this, the issues that we need to push for. Individually, as you challenge the viewer individually and what they can do, because there's an individual part that everyone can play, what will you, Mohamed Adow, as a director of Power Shift, continue to do moving forward now that you have the Nairobi Declaration, and what can that person do where they are?
I think as a think tank, we'll continue to provide thought leadership for Africa. My hope is we can be able to put forward a shared Pan-African vision that allows us to address the intersecting crises of hunger, energy crisis, climate crisis, and the debt crisis. That is something we can offer. And we've put out a report called Just Transition, an alternative development vision for Africa that allows us to address these structural crises. But if all of us have to actually contribute, the choices we make around the food we eat is important. Is it food that is imported? Is it food that is produced locally in Nairobi, in Kenya, that is actually produced through agroecological practices? And that is important. And then the energy we consume in Kenya is 92% renewable, but it's still not affordable. Why are we still tied to, IPPs that allows us to pay contract when the electricity prices, particularly of renewable, is falling? The cost of electricity and particularly renewable energy is plummeting. Why can't we pass that benefit to the end energy user? What are the reforms that will actually be instigated in this country that will make electricity accessible and affordable so that we can power our economy and power it in a sustainable manner so that we can develop in a climate compatible way? I think there's an opportunity for this continent to develop in a climate compatible way, to power our economy in a climate compatible way. But that will take African leadership recognizing the climate threat we face and the incredible potential that we have. You've heard from our leaders, we have the best arable land in the world. Why can't we use it to produce sufficient food that is culturally appropriate and nutritious for African people? You've heard We're blessed with the best solar in the world,
Yep.
and the best wind, and 40% of the critical minerals. Why can't we use that to power Africa's energy and in a way that is sustainable? You've heard we have 70% of our population under the age of 30. I hope our best days are ahead of us, just like young people. But can we afford an opportunity to these young people so that they can actually secure their future with us playing the right role of enabling them? So it's not enough, like we've done with the Nairobi Declaration, provide an African context, line out the African opportunities without marshalling the energy and the resources that will help us realize the Africa we want. We can make this century the African century, but only if we harness these opportunities. And that is a call that we're giving out from Nairobi.
Mr. Mohamed Adow, thank you so much from Power Shift Africa, a climate and energy think tank. As you promised and pledged that you'll continue to push and give thought leadership for the continent moving forward. It doesn't stop here. This is a conversation starter, something you've been part of. We appreciate the time that you've given us. You've heard his insights on what can be done at the high level and at the individual level. The oxymoron that I go out with here is that we have so much in the continent, so much, but nothing to show. Something to think about and change that. We need a power shift
In the continent.
and that's for you, the Social Newsroom, and we are winding up here the coverage and looking at the activities because this is the last day of the Africa Climate Summit here in Nairobi.